On today's podcast, we're going straight at the questions that actually determine whether retirement works or fails. Joining me is Brett, who has built and stress tested over 200 financial and retirement plans over the past 2 years. I'm a certified financial planner, and together we see exactly where people get this right and where they get it terribly wrong. Today, we're answering the 3 questions that every retiree asks, but rarely gets a clear answer to. First, how much money do you actually need to retire comfortably? Second, at what age should you begin taking Social Security? And third, what's the single biggest risk in retirement planning? On the last one, Brett and I don't agree, so you get to decide. And a little plug before starting, we've got a free retirement readiness quiz on our website, lifegoalinvestments.com. If you're wondering if you're ready, fill that out and you'll get our free retirement guide. All right, that's enough. Let's go. From Wall Street to managing hundreds of millions in client money, Nick and I use our alphabet soup of credentials to discuss the investing and tax strategies that actually work. Oh, and we played Division I college football together, so strap in. This one hits hard. Let's go. All right, guys, you hear from me every day on social media. We're talking about retirement, Social Security, etc. But we've got today the man, the myth, the legend, also my brother, Brett Sans, on the line. And the reason we brought him in is today's podcast is going to be all about retirement planning. And Brett has officially done over 200 financial plans and retirement plans in the past 2 years. So, Brett, what is the key thing to focus on before anything else when it comes to retirement planning?
So over the last 2 years, we've done over 200 retirement plans as a firm. I checked the software this morning just to counter check that, and over 200 is the number. I think the biggest thing that people can do to put themselves ahead of the field is to start early, right? So I'll pick on myself. I'm 42 years old. It makes a lot more sense to start a financial plan at age 42 than it does at 62. You may ask yourself why. I'm not retiring for a long time. I have no idea what it's going to be like in retirement. The reality is when you're 42, you've got around 2 decades, maybe even 2.5 decades to adjust your behavior. Whereas if you're 62, it's almost game time, right? You have no ability to adjust the numbers up or down, whether it's saving, and you might just be forced to work longer.
Yeah. The work longer thing is always a fun topic to bring up with clients, right? Fortunately, not too many of ours have to do that. But it's the same thing when it comes to, just compounding returns, right? Saving earlier in your life. You start investing when you're 20, the same dollar is worth a heck of a lot less at 45 than it is 25. So here's a question. It just creates anxiety to folks when they think about retirement planning. Why is it that it is so darn hard for folks?
So there's just so many darn moving pieces, right? When you think about retirement, everybody thinks about, one number. What's my number, right? That's the bit of it that they bury themselves in. But really, what you need to be thinking about is all the different moving parts. Inflation, time. Am I going to live in my current spot or I'm going to move to a new spot? Taxes are obviously a component. Your returns. Backward looking, the returns on the stock market have been incredibly strong, which has helped 401ks, grow to record levels. But the return profile looking forward may not be quite as fruitful, and that's not our forecast. That's the consensus street forecast. So it just has to do with the amount of variables. And then if you're going to extrapolate data over decades, right, because that's what we're doing. We're going to compound returns over decades, whether it's inflation's return or your investment portfolio's return or the cost of healthcare, which compounds at twice the cost of your typical inflation. When you compound these things over decades, you have to be very, very precise with the calculation. Otherwise, the numbers aren't going to come out right because compounding numbers extrapolates a miss over time.
Yeah. You talked about the rearview mirror looking stock market returns. We can make any financial plan on the planet work if we're going to assume that we're going to perpetuate 16%, which is what the S&P has done over the past 10 years in perpetuity going forward. That's just not reality. So, okay, we got that. We got why it's hard, why it feels daunting to folks. So now let's get right into the meat of this conversation. Brett, the brass tacks question of this, how much money do you need to retire?
Yes. I'm going to spin the question directly back to the person asking it, and I'm going to say to them, hey, how much do you spend per month, right? Let's start breaking this thing down. How much do you spend per month? And the funny thing is we kind of have three groups of people, right? You have the first group of people, we ask them that, and they go, I got no idea. Really, no idea. I always chuckle, and I'm like, all right, well, I'll make one up. We can come back and fix it. You got the next group of people, which they have a pretty good idea, right? They've got a decent idea, and they can kind of muscle it together. Then you have the third group of people that are my favorite. They go, hold on, I got an Excel file. They pull up the Excel file. You can bet your butt they've got 19 tabs on the Excel file. And not only do they have all their expenses, but they've also gone in and just muscled up, right? They have built out, what is inflation going to do to my numbers? What are my return assumptions? They've got this thing built, all these different ways with all these different assumptions. And you got to give them an A++ for effort because it's daunting, and they go in and they do a pretty darn good job, most of them. But that's the third type of person, is the person knows exactly how much they spend. So that is, that's, you just get a kick out of the different types of people that are out there. And
you know what you call those people? Those people are called engineers.
Yeah, engineers, accountants. The funny thing too is it doesn't necessarily mean it's the wealthiest people that do that. I can think of one group of one couple out in the western part of the country. I won't pick on them specifically, but they've got all the money in the world, and they aren't dialed in at all on how much they're spending, and they want to spend it all. But just super funny to see how different people end up in different spots, when you spin that question back to them. But that's the number one question, is if you can figure out how much you spend per month, that we can get off to a pretty good start on building things around that. And obviously the software is the ticket, right? Like without the software, we would be lost. We'd be lost in the Excel file.
Yeah. Well, I think you made a couple interesting points there. And you said that a lot of times, wealthy folks don't really have any idea whatsoever. And their prerogative is just, hey, I make enough money where this is never going to matter. I'm always going to make more money than I have from an expense standpoint, and just continue to have that ball move forward accordingly. But, that changes when you move into retirement. And the other thing that I think you brought up there is that a lot of folks have this phenomenal planning on their own, right? In kind of rudimentary ways of an Excel spreadsheet. But you've mentioned to me several times in the past that, hey, this person they're so organized, they know exactly what their expenses are, and they're forecasting 1% inflation, or they're forecasting 5% inflation. And when it comes to returns, they're forecasting X or Z, whatever it is. And that makes the plan work or not work. And not always is that something that's an actual reality, right? I mean, that's the way I see it. And that's what you've explained to me. Is that fair?
For sure. So, lucky for us, the industry has terrific software, right? So we have chosen to partner with a software company that helps us, do all of this, right? But one of the things that we can do is the investment portfolio. We can go ahead and go all the way down to the sector level, small caps, non-US stocks, bonds, alternatives, whatever it may be, and we can set a forecasted return. And actually what we'll often do is go out and use industry data, consensus industry data for forecasted returns, and we'll use that as the return assumption rather than saying, well, hey, Life Goal thinks that we're going to do 10% a year on stocks, so we're just going to put in 10%. We can be better than that, right? So we'll go out there, we'll get the street consensus data, we'll massage that into the back end of the software, and then what we'll do is we'll set your portfolio up as we think it makes sense, and then we'll have those street consensus forecasted returns over the next 10 years back into your asset allocation, right? The pie chart. And then if, say you're a third stocks, a third bonds, a third alternatives, that will then give us a forecasted return on your actual portfolio, right? Which is super cool. And it might not just be the portfolio that you have on Charles Schwab, which happens to be the investment platform we use, but your spouse's 401k may still be at work, right? So you can suck the 401k in, and you can get that into the asset allocation mix, or you may have money in a private equity investment or something that's not being captured. We can suck all this into the back end of the software, and you get a holistic picture that allows us to have a pretty good overall look at your wealth and your financial situation, and then model appropriately forward looking over the decades to come until you get to retirement. Or maybe it's not decades, maybe it's this year, maybe it's maybe it's coming up. So
yeah, I think that it's important to start to think about, okay, where is broader America right now? And what I mean by that is Vanguard just went out and did surveys, not Vanguard, or surveys per se. It was Vanguard. It wasn't surveys that they were doing. They were just capturing data of folks on their platform. And they were saying, what is the median, right? The median is not the average, which strips out the anomalies, the outliers that can suck things around and pull them around. What does the median 65-year-old have in their 401k right now? And I'll just give you some of this data. So the median 65-year-old has about $95,000 in their 401k. From 54 to 64, the average is about 95 as well, median. From 45 to 54, it's 68,000. From 34 to 44, it's 40. And from 25 to 34, it's 16,000. So those are just the median numbers. Again, we're stripping out the anomalies by taking out the outliers, which is what an average does. But now let's start to think about, okay, Brett, we asked you how much money do you need? And we're going to get into more of the basics of what questions need to be asked to actually model that after someone's individual life. But let me give you some JP Morgan data now. So they ran this in two different ways. So what we're going to look at here is how much money folks actually spend per year in retirement. And they looked at it for two different cohorts. One that has $250,000 to $750,000 in investable assets. And think about this in what they call the go-go years, the slow-go years, and the no-go years. So during the go-go years, which is 60 to 70, they spend on average just over $72,000 a year. From 70 to 80, which is the slow-go years, they're spending 63. So you see they're knocking it down in a pretty big way as they change their living patterns. And then the no-go years over 80, they're spending about $53,000. And now I'll just reiterate those exact same numbers for folks that have $1 to $3 million of investable assets. From 60 to 70, it's $115,000. From 70 to 80 in the slow-go years, it's $98,000. And over 80, it's about $90,000 per year. So Brett, let me just ask you to begin with there. Obviously, us in the wealth management space, we happen to work with typically just more people that have a little bit more affluence, right? That's just the nature of the beast that we work in. Does that latter set of numbers that I gave you there, does that seem to jive with what we're seeing on a day in and day out basis as you run these 200 financial plans over the past 2 years?
Yeah, it sure does. And we can pick on our parents. Our parents right now happen to be, they just got back from Cancun, Mexico, and they're a couple more weeks, they'll be headed to Florida. And it's, and they're not the wealthiest people in the world. They've done very well and worked hard all their life and saved well. But as you have the folks going into the, into the go-go years, right, which is your first few years into retirement or even the first decade into retirement, they're spending right now. They're spending because that's what they dreamed of. Most of them actually made a heck of a lot of money and they've saved a tremendous amount of money, right? And they don't spend generally. Like when they're at home, they live a pretty tight budget. So, but they're out there and they're traveling and spending right now. So those numbers do definitely align. And I think, one of the questions, so the question, right? So how much money do we actually need in retirement? So you have a few different categories where the spending typically, falls into place and where it's a question mark. And you say, well, what's going to change, right? If not a lot's going to change, you're probably going to spend exactly what you're spending right now. So is your house going to be the same? Or are you going to buy a second house? Or are you going to live in the house you're at? You still have a mortgage, yes or no? How many years are left on it, right? One of the big things, I'll pick on her mom again. I love her. She will not stop remodeling the dang house. My dad's going to lose his mind, right? She remodels the house every spring, new project, let's go. So home improvements, and it's not just her, right? I hear home improvements all the time. Home improvements is a big one. Empty nest. Is the empty nest, is it going to be the kids? You're going to have maybe one kid that is continuing to live at home for a variety of reasons, maybe even parents. A lot of times you're going to have a parent or two potentially with you. So that's question mark. And then
Brett, let me interject just on the remodeling the house topic, just because our parents have kind of role reversal, we'll call it, where my mother is incredibly handy, or our mother, I should be saying, and our father is just, he can't find a dipstick under the hood of the car, whatever. So anyway, I walk into their house one day, and Brett's heard me tell this story before, but when I walked in, I was dropping my kids off for them to watch them for the day, and there is a wall that's dividing two rooms. And so I come back at the end of the day after work, and the wall is gone. And I walk in, and my dad's watching the kids, and I'm like, that's not you, no chance. And he's like, no, that was your mom. But it's just a role reversal that seems to take place in our house. But to your point, she is a beast. And she does a lot of it on her own, way more than any average person can do. But to your point, Brett, she's spending doing it. And that's something that's got to be accounted for in the plan.
And it wasn't, right? But good for them. And it wasn't. But good for them that they had saved enough, and they live a conservative lifestyle outside of that, right? And going on some vacations, but they budgeted accordingly. So one thing too that people always do, which is kind of, a behavioral, just a natural tendency for people, especially this age cohort, right? Their entire life, they essentially were poor. And now now they're almost at retirement. They thought they were poor. They're almost at retirement. They blink, they look at the data. We look at the data and the software with them, and they're like, holy smokes, like they're actually not at all poor, but they act like they're poor. They save and spend as if, they don't have a tremendous amount of money. So when we're building the plans, one thing that I always try to work with people on is don't try to, manipulate the plan to make it more conservative. I want your best guess. I want your best guess. We'll use those numbers, and there are other ways to make the plan conservative. Like we can say that you're going to spend, in certain categories, spend more, or the investment portfolio is not going to return. That stock sleeve isn't going to return 15% a year like it has over the last 5 years. We're going to model much lower than that in other ways. So you want to use your best guess. Do not go in and say, hey, I'm going to travel more in retirement, and I've been spending $7,000 or $8,000 a month on my living expenses, so now I'm going to bump that up to 14. You can't do it because everything gets multiplied by 12, right? So when you multiply something by 12, it just blows the number up. So what we'll do is we'll satellite the vacations, and we'll do 2 a year, 3 a year, whatever it may be, rather than adjusting the monthly input. So there's some things like that we've learned that have definitely helped folks. And then the other thing is just the other change that can happen is, are you planning on giving money to family along the way? Right. And you maybe, one of the number one things that people like to do is give money to their grandkids for school. That is pretty consistent. The other one in college, that is. The other one is also quite consistent, is, are you going to inherit money? And if so, when is that going to come? And people don't know, and they typically don't know exactly the date, but, do we want to be realistic about forecasting that? And a lot of times people say, no, I don't want to. And they'll just say like, okay, well, that's how they know that it's coming, right? But they don't want to put it in for a variety of reasons. And that is also a way to make the plan conservative. You're going to get $1 million or $500,000 or whatever the number is at some point in time. Maybe it's 100,000 that's coming, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. It's a good way to make the plan conservative.
Yeah, and I think that you have to face the reality of the folks that we're talking about that are going into retirement right now, and the psychological mindset that they grew up in. A lot of the time, their parents were born in the Great Depression, right? Where you had to literally scrape and just fight tooth and nail to get by, and there was no extras in life. And so they haven't lived with any of those extras. And more often than not, we're telling people like, get out there and enjoy your money. Right? Which is kind of crazy to say, but you have the ability, you've worked your butt off for your entire life, like get out there and spend this. And they just have deep pockets with short arms, right? They just can't find their way to the bottom to grab that money out to spend it. But that's more often than the contrary of, hey, and I'm not saying that we don't ever see it. We do occasionally see someone that's just, hey, you got to batten down the hatches a little bit on your spending. But more often than not, it's the other way. It's the other way where they're gonna die if they don't change with what they're doing, with a heck of a lot of money. And that's not necessarily what we see wealth and money for. It's to live the life that you want to live. And I know Brett's over there laughing to himself because I'm not great at that personally, right? I'm incredibly conservative personally from a spending perspective. So I know he's saying I'm pot calling the kettle black, but probably true.
Yeah, that's another thing just on the software, like the software is so incredible. We can go in, and I'll try to stress that point to people. And usually it's husband and wife, not always, but sometimes, or not always, most of the time. And they'll dicker with each other a little bit. But we'll say, okay, well, guess what? I'm going to model in $50,000 a year in vacations just to show you, what's going on here. And we can easily do that. Or I'm going to model in, you buying a brand new vehicle every 3 years, and paying cash for it, trading, doing your trading or whatever, another $50K. And the plan will still show 100% likelihood of success. And what that means is that your money outlives you. With the spending, we have told it you want to spend, right? So we designed this as a team. And you're not going to break the plan by spending a little. So we'll put in some obnoxious numbers just to really drive the point home, and then we'll dial them back to what we think reality is. But the software really helps people kind of get their head around that, and then you can actually go into retirement and look at every single year and look and see what the cash flows are for every year. And when you're trying to get people comfortable with spending more when it's against the grain of their, of the way they were, brought up and have lived their lives, it's kind of the best way to do it. And then they still oftentimes will not they'll circle back to their old ways. But it's like, at least we showed them, and the husband will get after the wife about it, or the wife will get after the husband about it. Like, listen, we got to loosen up a little bit here.
There's always a spender, and there's always the spender, and then there's always the person that doesn't want to spend a dime, and it's back and forth. And usually it's the person that's the spender. Even if they spent as much as they wanted, they'd still be in a fine financial position. And again, let me caveat this with just the nature of the business. Like, we end up working with families that typically have a little bit more money. We realize that the average American out there is struggling to get by and does need to save more, especially based on the numbers I just gave you there. The median person needs to work on the saving more. But a lot of the folks that we're dealing with have had fruitful careers, and you get the point there. So,
right. We don't want it to come off wrong, but we're just, 200 and some financial plans. I'm just giving you the results of what we've seen, because I think that's what people are most interested in hearing. So, Taylor, big question, right? Social Security. When should you take Social Security?
Yeah. I think it's all dependent upon the underlying person, but there are some broad strokes, and I'll use some of my own personal information to just kind of drive home how the math works, right? So right now, and you could log into SSA.gov. Everybody should. You should log into SSA.gov and see what your monthly benefits will be via Social Security, given different ages when you can start taking it, right? So the earliest anyone can take it is at 62 years old. And at 62 years old, my payment right now is forecasted to be $2,860. So $2,860. And if I wait till full retirement, my payment is expected to be $4,073. So right on the onset there, when you talk about, a $1,200 spread between the two of them, it seems like an absolute home run. Let's wait until we're 67 years old. But then you start to peel back the onion a little bit, and you realize if you start taking at 62, there are 60 monthly payments that you're getting before you would ever get one taking it at 67. So one of the ways to look at this is to say, okay, if we take the actual monthly payment and you just add them together, and you don't do any arithmetic, no compounding of anything, none of that, you just add them together, taking at 62 for me versus taking at 67 at full retirement age, the break even when the cumulative monthly payments would be more by waiting doesn't happen until I'm 79 years old. So one, like the average male in the US right now kicks the bucket at 75. Now, I do think people are going to start living longer, don't get me wrong. But that was with no assumptions built into it, right? So if you're taking it at 62 because you need it, well, that's an obvious answer. You need it to live your life. But if you don't need it at 62, that means you can invest it, right? And so we model in and show, okay, listen, if we've got a modest 7% return here on these underlying assets, and I'm taking this monthly payment for 5 full years, 60 payments, before I'm ever getting that 67,000, or at that first payment at 67 years old, full retirement age, and you start to compound at 7% on both assumptions, your break even never, ever happens until you're the oldest person that ever lived and walked planet Earth, 115 years old. Like, I think there have been a couple people that have lived that long, but that's when the break even starts to kick through. So we look at it and say, I want the flexibility to touch the money before, if I want to live my life and do whatever it is. If I need it, take it. But the math just says take it, right? The math says take it for most folks. And so more often than not, when we're running these plans and the software kicks out an answer to us that says, hey, when should you take it? Brett, what are they telling them? You're running them. What are they telling you?
Yeah, most of the time, if people are going to step away from their careers as a family, married, filing joint, most of the time we're taking it, right? We're taking it early. But if they are going to continue to work in some capacity, or maybe they have rental properties or something that's generating a lot of income, those type of things can skew the numbers. So obviously everything's got to be customized, but we will tend to start taking it earlier. All else being equal, and that's just because even if they're not using the money, the portfolio will compound it for them, which is exactly what's going on if it's staying within the Social Security program anyways. So, we're taking it early unless they're going to work, pretty much.
Let's not forget this, and this is not meant to be a death and despair type conversation, but literally, if you go to SSA.gov, it says very bluntly that unless we have meaningful changes by Congress in spending habits, we are not going to be able to afford to pay out the promised payments right now past 2034, at which case we will reduce them by 20%. Now, we haven't factored any of that into anything, right? And I think that it's probably political suicide if someone comes into office and then effectively cuts Social Security payments by 20%, because we know that the vast majority of Americans are highly dependent upon that money to live their life. But at the end of the day, we're in $38 trillion worth of debt right now. And the number one expense of the government every single year are Social Security benefits. So the biggest differentiator you can pull from there is that. And right now, they're saying unless we change our ways, we are going to run into that situation at 2034, at which case we will cut by 20%. And none of that was modeled into anything that I just described to you there.
Yeah. You're staring down the barrel of a debt problem. And I can tell you that if a politician does have to reduce the Social Security payments, it's not going to be a rainy, sunny day out there in the economy, right? It's going to be ugly, right? It's going to happen in a backdrop where there's a lot of problems going on, not probably just in the United States, but in the world, right? And if the U.S. economy sneezes, the world gets a cold, right? So if there's something like that going on, it's not going to be on a backdrop where the economy's just going ho-hum, doing great. It's going to be during incredibly challenging times, and that's how it would actually potentially get pushed through. Otherwise, to your point, no chance.
Austerity is not something anyone wants to talk about.
No.
All right. So, Brett, let's now shift gears here and let's talk about what a portfolio should look like. And before I let you describe that, because you're going to be best suited to describe that, I will tell folks what one of the biggest mistakes we see are. What we see is that folks will compound these, especially these spreadsheet folks, they will compound the returns that we've experienced in the rearview mirror and act like they're going to perpetuate moving forward, right? And this is the second time I've brought this up, right? Stocks, the S&P 500 has annualized 16% return per year for the past 10. You can literally make any financial plan work going forward if you continue to think that 16% is what we're going to get out of the S&P 500. That is just not reality. So, Brett, when we talk about what the portfolio should look like, give me some of the considerations here. Give me, just the brass tacks of what does it look like?
Yep. So I think generally speaking, folks are looking for a combination of a few things, right? Income, right? Because they don't have a salary anymore. So we're looking to get them a transfer from essentially their account to their banking account on a monthly basis. So we've got to solve for that. And then predictability in the swings of the portfolio. And then also you really should have some growth in there, right? So and that doesn't necessarily mean like growth stocks, but growth coming from somewhere. So if you're drawing a certain amount out of the portfolio needs to generate more than that, so that it can continue to compound or at least hold water, because folks live a long time in retirement, right? We're forecasting out 3 decades plus. But the key thing is income, right? And we actually are driving income from all 3 buckets when we look at the portfolios that we design for a typical client. You're looking at
Brett, what do you mean when you talk about 3 buckets? Give me a little bit more on that.
Yeah, so just trying to remain diversified, right? So stocks, bonds, and alternatives, you can, without trying too hard, you can get meaningful income from all of those, right? Bonds are the natural answer. Bonds and cash are the historical answer. Stocks, dividends, historical answer. And then alternatives are another way to generate, very attractive income. You got to remember, if we're talking about running a portfolio for several decades, you're going to face all types of different economic storms. So we need to be as diversified as possible, because we don't know what storm is going to jump up and bite us, right? Is it going to be inflation, or is it going to be an economic contraction, better known as a recession? So you don't know what you're going to get. So you need to have an extremely diversified portfolio so that you can, feel good about weathering the storm. And then I would say that there's obviously other things that contribute to income. A lot of people have pensions, right? Not everybody, but a lot of folks have pensions. Social Security is a big one, right? If you think about Social Security, most folks, you just brought up what your Social Security monthly payment is. I noticed you didn't bring your wife's up, but there would be a second slug coming in there on a monthly basis. So if you have income coming from Social Security and the income coming off your investment portfolio, those are the 2 primary drivers. If there's a pension or real estate property or something else, that's just gravy on top. So essentially, what you're spending, patterns look like, and then we add up the income, and then, Taylor, I toss it back to you on the 4% rule.
Yep. Yeah, the 4% rule is just a long-term rule of thumb that has been tested every different way under the sun through all economic scenarios. They've run Monte Carlo simulations, which are just computer simulations to say, if you had taken 4% out in perpetuity of your retirement account, is there an environment where you would have ever outlived your money? And the answer to that is no, right? So you can draw 4% per year and effectively have your principal stay flat. And so 4% is something where you start to model for that, and you start to say, hey, if we want this never to run out and 4% is the number, well, Brett, what does that mean on $1 million?
Yeah. So 4% on $1 million, you're looking at 40,000. Most folks end up with Social Security payments that are, somewhere in the ballpark of Taylor's, maybe a touch under that. So between those two alone right there, you're bumping up against $100,000 in income. That's without stressing the portfolio at all. So, that covers the bulk of the expenses for most people. And keep in mind that we're forecasting returns, closer to 7 or 8%, depending on the risk profile of the client. So if you're only taking about half of the income or half of the return that the portfolio is creating, your portfolio is going to continue to grow. And actually, a lot of people, when we model it out and look at the software, they're going to, most of the time, when they pass, they're going to have more money than any other point in their life, and that's not just the super wealthy. That's a combination of two things. It's having enough money to have the income of the portfolio support you, and then it's also not spending like a drunken sailor. And actually, most folks have pretty conservative patterns there on the spending. So, but yeah, most of the financial plans, people end up. You see the slope of the chart, so the slope of the growth. When they retire, it flattens a little bit, but it tends to still grow modestly in retirement. And, that sets up nicely to be able to, gift money wherever's attractive to you. So, it's
that 4%. So Brett, just backing into that number again. So you said that 4% on $1 million plus Social Security puts someone at roughly kind of that $90,000 a year, et cetera. And when you look at the numbers here with folks that have $1 to $3 million of investable assets, this is just going back to JP Morgan. So the median point there being $2 million, right? The middle point there, they're spending $115,000 a year from 60 to 70, 98 from 70 to 80, and 90 from 80 on. So if you've got $1 million, then modeling for that $90,000 per year spend somewhere in that ballpark, that maths based on what JP Morgan told us and based on what you just told us there. So, thinking about, hey, is $1 million enough? Like in a lot of scenarios, that is a good number to try to get to at the end of the day, right?
It is. And that is, does the math. We always like it when that happens. That is also modeling in with healthcare costs, right? So we run the national average for healthcare costs. That's also having a nurse in your home 24/7, 365, the last 2 years of your life. 2 for you, 2 for your spouse. It's 4 years. So I'm not saying that this is, the highest of high, as far as luxury, but it's by no means, the opposite of that. It's a really nice setup, right? So I think folks are, the folks that have done a decent job saving and spend within, a reasonable amount, they can set themselves up for a really attractive retirement. And that's actually what we see most of the time is the numbers look pretty darn good.
Yeah, agreed there.
So Taylor, one of the big numbers that is in the plan that most people kind of scratch their head on a little bit is taxes.
Yeah.
So what do you think about taxes in retirement?
Taxes are an important thing to consider, and it's something that we haven't brought up even as we're roughing numbers out here thus far. So taxes, when you think about a retirement plan, whether it's a 401k, whether it's an IRA that's rolled out of a 401k, you have to realize Uncle Sam's never touched this, right? So you're putting that money away, and the value of a 401k is that Uncle Sam's never taking a dollar of it. So that $100 you made, $100 goes to work in that 401k, as opposed to if you take it out, you're giving up 20% or whatever your income tax is before you're able to invest it in a brokerage account. So there's an extra $20 there that's compounding for decades over time, and that is the power of what a 401k is. But the piper always shows up at some point, right? And that's on the back end. So when you start taking money out of an IRA, a traditional IRA, or out of a 401k, you're going to pay taxes on it. And one of the things that we get brought up to us a lot is, hey, is a Roth conversion worth it? And so folks are thinking about, hey, do I pay the tax now, move it to a Roth where it can then grow tax-free and will never be taxed when I take it out on the back end as well. And I will give you the broad stroke answer to that. The math does not math all that often to say that you should convert. You're really trying to thread a needle. And I think a lot of people spook folks in the market and say, listen, we're in $38 trillion of debt. We're going to have higher tax brackets in the future. Well, Brett, you and I have been in this business 15 and 20 years respectively, right? Or vice versa. Like, what direction have taxes gone, even though that's been the prevailing wisdom the entirety of that time?
Yeah, it's hard to get elected on a ballot saying, hey, I'm going to raise your taxes, right?
On middle class.
Right. Yep. And it's, you know who, when you look at the income brackets, you also know who you're raising the taxes on. If you're saying, hey, I'm going to support the folks that may have a slightly lower income, I'm going to raise the taxes on them. Guess who that is? That's retirees. So they're not making a lot because they don't work anymore. So the only income they have is what's coming off their investment portfolios. And guess what? They can't adjust their behavior. They're 60, they're 70, they're 80. And you know what else they do? These people show up and vote. So this is the cohort that's most likely to show up and vote.
They don't have a job that's, no, I can't make it to the ballot today on Tuesday, November 4th.
Yep. When you get there and you're standing in line waiting to vote, look around and you'll, those are the people that you cannot raise taxes on because you will not get voted in. And that's why it's kind of a non-starter. So that's what makes the math challenging on the Roth conversions. If somebody has extra money sitting around that's material, there are some creative things that we can do on our side to help get over the hump on the 2 or 3 year period that you may look to do the Roth conversion. But that's a conversation in its own right.
And the scenarios where the Roth conversion does make sense, to be clear, is after retirement. So your income, you retire from your career, your income drops demonstrably, and you're in a low tax bracket. And what you're going to do there is you're going to convert before required minimum distributions kick in. And so you're converting when your income's low, where your tax brackets are suppressed. But again, if you're doing that at 62 and RMDs don't kick in until 73, like that's 11 years of that additional 20% or whatever you just paid to Uncle Sam in taxes. That 20% is not compounding, right? And when you turn 73, is your tax bracket likely to be higher? RMDs are not that arduous, right? Brett, what do you see the typical RMD at in a plan? Because I think people have no concept as to, okay, if I got $1 million inside of a 401k or an IRA, like what does that RMD look like? I think people have this huge number in their head, and I don't think it's nearly as big as what they perceive it to be.
Yeah, it ends up not being that, that big of a number. It ends up being, tens of thousands, maybe slightly more than that for some folks, but not often. And generally speaking, they've whittled down some of their portfolio by that time anyway. Some of them, right? But it ends up not being the biggest number in the world, so it's not going to hugely swing the decision. The other time where we see a Roth conversion make sense is the 40-year-old that was making good money, and then they get laid off or something happens at the company, they get acquired or something, and they end up essentially looking for a job. So that year, their income may come in super low. That is the perfect situation, right? Yeah. Where they can do a Roth conversion on a year when they essentially have no income or very minimal income. That's the perfect situation. Better to do it then than, try to cross the bridge in retirement.
Yeah, fair. That is a good one-off. That doesn't happen that frequently, but when it does, it seems like a pretty opportune time to change things up there. So let's just talk now, kind of as we start to wrap up here a little bit. Let's talk about, Brett, what is the biggest risk when it comes to financial planning and retirement planning?
So I think the biggest risk after doing, pushing 200 of these things, more than that at the firm, but me personally pushing 200, is if you don't have a plan and if you're not utilizing, very capable software, that is the biggest risk. And I know you have a different opinion on what the biggest risk is, but I see, incredibly smart and detail-oriented people bring in Excel files that are, they put hours and hours into them, and they just are not sophisticated enough to model out many different return streams, spending changes, tax, the different tax implications associated with it, healthcare inflating at 5%, whereas cost of living inflates at 2.5%. All these different variables are very, very challenging to model in an Excel file, even though I give the people an attaboy that bring in the Excel files, and they're definitely easy to work with. But yeah, I'll kick it back to you. What do you think the biggest risk is?
I think the biggest risk is, and granted, this doesn't mean these two are mutually exclusive. They are not. But the biggest risk, just brass tacks again with what the biggest risk is a bad sequence of returns, right? So the biggest risk is you go into retirement in 2007 and 2008 hits, and your portfolio is not prepared for a 2008 because you've been in a 10-year bull market run and you're over your skis in stock market risk, and then 2008 happens, the S&P drew down in 2008 55%. You know what that means for someone that retired in 2007? They're going back to work, right? No one wants a financial plan or retirement plan that tells them there is a chance that you're going back to work, right? So if you're over your skis in risk, like you may have been able to handle that risk when you were chalking more money away every single year, adding to it. So a down market, boom, what do you care? You're putting more money in, buying stocks on the cheap, and it'll come back over time. Well, when you're down 55%, and this is a period of time when you're pulling money out of it, two things happen there. Just the math doesn't work where you're withdrawing and it's down 55%, right? Again, this is an extreme example of 2008, but say it's down 40%. We always have to have that mentality that stocks can drop 40%. So if you got $1 million, now you're dropped down, you're at 600,000. If you're removing 100,000 that year, now you're at 500,000. You've officially cut your underlying kind of retirement plan literally in half. You just cannot leave yourself susceptible to that level of risk. And too many folks, I think this is a function of the third time I brought this up now, it's a function of perpetuating rear view mirror returns going forward.
Yeah. When we're talking about decades, extreme events come up, right? It's a lot of time. A lot of time goes on, right? There's a lot of things that can pop up over decades. So generally speaking, one of the things that's critically important is getting the portfolio mix designed appropriately for the clients. Some clients are a nervous Nelly, right? They're just nervous. They're more likely to say, get me out, if there is any type of volatility in the portfolio. Whereas others, really don't even pay attention to the portfolio. They don't even look. So you could potentially run a slightly higher risk profile and it would benefit them. But we have to match it up. We have to match the risk profile up with the mindset of the individual. So that is critically important. And that also, and that's with bringing an extremely diversified portfolio to the table. So it's not just cash, bonds, and stocks, right? You have to have alternatives in there. We talk about that on other podcasts, but it's critically important, and they tend to drive attractive yields too, which is important. So one thing that we can talk to folks about and explain is that when the portfolio goes down in value, if the portfolio goes down in value, right? 2025, we had tariff information, we had the tariff news break in April. S&P was down 15, NASDAQ was down 20. Well, the portfolios were down a little bit too, right? They have stocks in them, but the portfolios were still generating the income, right? So even though the stock portfolio is down in value, doesn't mean that the dividends aren't being paid, doesn't mean that the bonds aren't still kicking off coupons, and it doesn't mean the alternatives aren't continuing to pay dividends. So as you speak to folks about, hey, what should the asset mix looks like? A lot of times people say, oh, retirement. I was always a stock investor. I go into retirement. Now I just do bonds. Nah, let's take a step back from that and make sure that the portfolio is more diversified. But just kind of explaining where the income is coming from, I think puts people at ease. And even saying, hey, in 2008, stocks kept paying their dividends, most of them, right? Bonds continued to kick off the coupons. And then, depending on the alternatives, what the makeup is, you likely would continue to get yield there as well. So I think just spending some time explaining income, where it's coming from, why it's happening, and what will happen in an extreme scenario really can set people mind at ease, which is what we want. We want them to be able to enjoy their retirement and not be nervous about things. So that would be the other one to me, is just making sure that the portfolio mix is designed appropriately for, how nervous the individual may or may not be.
Yeah, Brett, let me try to wrap a bow on this. And I think that what I heard from you out of your mouth 15 times, and I don't know if this was intentional or not, was you said the software 15 times, right? And at the end of the day, like what we're talking about here are highly variable events. You're talking about rates of returns on investments. You're talking about inflation. You're talking about taxes, all complete unknowns on a go-forward basis, right? And the portfolio needs to be able to manipulate itself, and the financial plan and the retirement plan needs to be able to manipulate itself on an ongoing basis. And the only way to do that and effectively know it's done correctly, as smart as these folks are showing up with these Excel spreadsheets, they just have variables in them that are off. And those small tweaks in variables compounded, to Brett's point, over 20 and 30 years drive a demonstrable difference as to whether the retirement plan is going to be successful or not. So Brett, you tell me if I'm wrong, but you pounded the table on the software there. And there are lots of softwares out there, some better than others. But obviously you feel it's incredibly important to have your financial plan, retirement plan built into one of these softwares.
I don't think that there's any way you could do it without it. And I know that, 30, 40 years ago, I'm sure they didn't have fancy software like this to model this stuff. But the fact that it's out there and you can access it and use it. And the biggest thing you can do with the software is you can just change the numbers, right? You can constantly play with the numbers. Retire at 67, retire at 65, retire at 62, retire at 55. We have a lot of young folks coming to us saying, hey, I don't want to work, past whatever the given age is. Can we try to model for that? And then we model for it and we see if we can or we can't. But if you had to, go in and try to rework an Excel file rather than, just change some buttons in a software program and then actually feel confident that the data is accurate, I just don't know how you would do it without it. And then the other beautiful thing is, guess what? If we log back in 6 months, we hit refresh, it sucks in all the investment numbers from 5 to 6, 10, as many institutions as you want to connect to the software. Your bank can connect, wherever you have your, banking account, checking account, your investment portfolios, all that stuff will get sucked in real time, refresh. Credit cards are one of the biggest things. Yeah, but I don't carry a balance on my credit card. Great. I'm glad that you don't. But what it does is it itemizes and allows us to gather data on your spending for maybe 3 decades before you retire. So if we're gathering your monthly spending every single month, how great of a job we're going to be able to say, hey, I can see over the last 12 months that you averaged, $7,000 a month, excluding your mortgage. Obviously, we know exactly what the mortgage payment's going to be. If we can look at that because it's been sucked in real time and itemized for us in all the given categories, it makes it very easy to forecast out into retirement. Whereas if you don't have that information coming from the credit card, it's, makes it a lot harder to kind of, guess a number. So I just don't see how anybody could do it without the software, and it makes it easy. And then again, you can hit refresh 2 years from now. It'll suck in all the new data. We can check and see how it's going. And obviously it's not every 2 years, but you can check whenever you want and suck in the information. And it just really gives people conviction that everything is on track, and it sets their mind at ease and allows them to focus on what they want to actually focus on, which is enjoying the extra free time that they have.
Quick ask. If you're enjoying the show, hit the follow and drop a rating. It helps more folks find our podcast. Thanks so much.
The information discussed in this video is for educational purposes only and should not be considered investment, tax, or financial advice. Investing involves risk, including possible loss of principal. Always consult a qualified financial professional before making any investment decisions. Past performance is not indicative of future results.